cool, but starting out cool. 53 degrees, not too bad at all. Daniel Gallagher is on the phone, and part of this whole election thing, that he's not going to talk about the elections, but one of the things that comes up a lot is corporations. And you hear people who don't like corporations or want to tax corporations, and those who don't, and those who do. It's just, you hear all sides. Daniel is the former commissioner of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. He served from November 2011 till October 2015. He is a critic of Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, and I know a lot of you are also a critic of that, and he's an ardent supporter of the Jobs Act. He's talking to us about the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission considering changes to its corporate disclosure framework. It's a little bit over my head, but I learned a little bit about this from our listeners. Our listeners are actually up on this one. Daniel, good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great, Larry. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from the D.C. area. I'm actually, I live in Baltimore but work in D.C., so I'm calling you from home in Baltimore.
All right, so what are the changes that we need to be paying attention to?
Well, so look, I think this is a really important issue, and it sounds like you've got great listeners who pay attention to this issue, so I'm hoping they take this to heart. But recently, the SEC issued what they call a concept release, which is really kind of just like a white paper. You know, they issue it and say, we're thinking about these things. And this white paper dealt with the types of information that public companies, corporations, provide to their investors. And the standard by which companies provide that information is something we call materiality. And it's a sort of half a century old standard that the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall is the one who created the standard. And it really just means that companies should disclose the types of information that a reasonable investor would want to have when making an investment decision. So it sounds pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
What would the reasonable investor want to know?
It sounds reasonable, too.
It does sound reasonable, and it speaks to the entire base of investors. It doesn't subdivide you up and say, what's important to you, Larry? What's important to you, Robin?
Right.
Or that. That's very distracting, as you might imagine, very costly. Now, in this document, this concept release that the SEC put out, they said, well, maybe we should get away from that. Maybe we should think about idiosyncratic disclosures that are important to specific activist groups, whether they be environmental groups or social issues, political issues, religious groups, and things like that. Because there's a real push, Larry, by these groups for this type of disclosure, and it's an effort that's been underway for decades. But it's really, as you teed up at the beginning of the show here, it's reached a fevered pitch, I think, because of the election year, because of sort of acrid environment that we have in Washington, the very highly political atmosphere. And so public companies are getting pressure from sort of all sides, from the groups themselves, because they're oftentimes investors in the company, so they have to deal with them as shareholders and, respectfully try to take their views on board, and while at the same time preserving this notion of materiality. But now they're actually getting pressure from the government, right? The groups aren't satisfied, necessarily dealing directly with the companies. They're trying to force the government to put in new disclosure requirements. And this is a very real issue. It's not just some sort of down the road potential harm. It's something we saw in the Dodd-Frank Act, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. Dodd-Frank was supposed to be the response by the government to the financial crisis. And lo and behold, within it, Larry, I don't know if you noticed, there are mandated disclosures for public companies of all sorts of flavors. There's the conflict mineral disclosure requirement. There's the oil and gas lease disclosure requirement, the mine safety requirement, and the pay ratio disclosure. All of these things were very important to certain activist groups who lobbied Congress and got the information and the mandates included in Dodd-Frank. And if you look at the SEC rulemakings, many of which I had to vote on, and I lost pretty much all of those votes when I was on the commission. If you look at the rulemakings and you look at the estimate of costs, we're talking billions of dollars in cost to these public companies. And guess who pays that at the end of the day, Larry?
We do, right? Taxpayer?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You got it. It's an implicit tax on investors. It's coming out of your investment returns. It's coming out of your retirement returns, your college savings, and I think that's a real tragedy for the average investor.
Does whoever is elected president have an effect on this, or will it have an effect on that, I should say, one way or the other?
Yeah, I think it's actually a very stark contrast here that so many of these issues are under the control of those who head the agencies, and of course my focus is the SEC. And if you have an SEC chair under in a Clinton administration that believes strongly that companies should be focusing on things other than what's material, then there's a lot of latitude for the SEC to require these disclosures. In a Trump administration, I would assume that any SEC chair would not focus on those issues, but the trend is clear, and the issues are teed up pretty squarely. That very many interest groups and certainly politicians in the U.S. Congress want to use the SEC disclosure regime to reach certain specific goals that might be at odds with the average investor.
And does the average constituent of Congress, do we all get it? I mean, do we get what this is about, or is this something we need to educate ourselves on?
You know what? It's a great question. The average investor has to educate themselves, and I get it. Believe me, I spent years toiling away at the commission. I understand that investors have jobs and kids and other obligations, and wading through disclosure documents or becoming educated about efforts like this is hard. But I have to tell you, it's critical. That unless folks want to have sort of the European style economy where companies are more focused on things other than economic returns, then we need to pay attention. Investors need to become educated. They need to be able to vote their shares the right way, to pay attention to these issues. When I was on the commission, Larry, I gave a speech that if your listeners are interested, I would recommend that they look at. It's at sec.gov.
Okay.
And you go to the speeches tab, and you look for a June 5, 2014 speech I gave on this issue, and I think it's pretty succinct, short and sweet, but it tees this up pretty neatly if folks are interested. And then they can go and they can look at various trade group websites. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has done a really good job tracking these issues. The Business Roundtable has done a good job.
Well,
There's a lot of... Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna check that out. So go to the speeches tab at sec.gov and the June 25th, 2014 speech by Daniel Gallagher. Daniel, my gosh, you've given us a lot of homework and helped us understand something that is kind of over my head, to be honest with you. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for helping us out. I know our listeners will jump on this one.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you guys.
Thank you. All right, we will be right back. This is WOCA.
Fox News Radio, I'm Carmen Roberts. 2 weeks before Election Day, and another controversy pops up. Premiums for the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, will go up sharply next year and average 25%.
Hillary Clinton has been distancing herself from Obamacare during her campaign.